Good evening. Hi, welcome. Welcome to the New Haven Museum. I'm Margaret Ann Tomaszewski, Executive Director, and the museum is pleased to host tonight's celebration marking the 10th anniversary of the publication of African American Connecticut Explored. 10 years ago in March, the museum was honored to host the book's launch in New Haven, attended by more than 80 people, and it was held during Women's History Month. And the program highlighted women's stories from the book, such as that of Anna Louise James, the first African American woman to graduate from the Brooklyn College of Pharmacy. And in attendance were several individuals who knew Miss James, and for whom the soda fountain at the James Pharmacy in Old Saybrook marked their passage through childhood. The public enthusiastic response to the event, and the request for more programs about Black history and the events of the past 10 years continue to motivate our staff in our thinking about our role as the city's history museum, the exhibits and programs we offer, and the histories that still need to be shared through collaboration, co-creation, and partnership. Later this month, we will host the exhibition Shining Light on Truth, New Haven, Yale, and Slavery, organized by the Beinecke Library in conjunction with the publication of David Blight's book on the findings of the Yale and Slavery Project. And in early March, we will reopen a refreshed Amistad Gallery, welcoming back the iconic portrait of Sembe P.A. Sinke to New Haven from the conclusion of the exhibition tour for Afro-Atlantic Histories. This event tonight is part of the museum's NH250, an ongoing series of programming developed by the museum to complement America 250, culminating with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The series highlights inclusive, local, and lesser-known stories connecting the past with the present. So, the museum is honored to welcome so many distinguished scholars for tonight's discussion, and I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Norman, the founding publisher, emeritus of Connecticut Explored, and the editor of African American Connecticut Explored.
Thank you so much. So, I'm Elizabeth Norman, founding publisher and president emeritus of Connecticut Explored. Thank you so much for being here tonight to mark the 10th anniversary of African American Connecticut Explored. I hope you all either have your copy with you or you have it right by your bedside table and regular reading. I am also very proud to say that the book is featured in the Connecticut Museum of Culture and Histories, formerly Connecticut Historical Society, their current exhibition, Connecticut's Bookshelf, as their research library's most checked out book. I went to see the show just because, I love books and I love Connecticut history, and, when I turned the corner and saw it there, I was just, gobsmacked because I'm in a museum. It's in a museum. I never expected that. So I want to begin by thanking Kathy Hermes, who's of course here with us tonight, the current publisher of Connecticut Explored, for not only taking on the magazine when I retired a year and a half ago, a little bit more than that, but also for planning tonight's event, so all the credit goes to her there. I love how the talk tonight by our distinguished scholars is going to look forward, or more to the recent past and looking forward. I also want to thank the New Haven Museum for hosting us. The New Haven Museum has been a great partner. We've had some fantastic programs here. One more acknowledgement is the event marking the Constance Baker Motley U.S. postage stamp that's happening across town. We learned about that only a few days ago. Too late to change our plans, but we want to, of course, mark this important moment as well. So, 10 years ago, I stood here with Dr. Frank Mitchell, Dr. Stacy Close, to launch this book, and I want to thank them both for being here today, and again, for their critical involvement in bringing this book into being. I also include in my gratitude the late Catherine Harris, who Stacy will speak about more in a moment. And our collaborators, the Connecticut Freedom Trail, then represented by Mary Donahue and Cora Murray, and the Onstad Center for Art and Culture, our co-publisher, then represented by Frank, and then Executive Director Olivia White, who's also here with us tonight, and also a friend of the project, Connie Green. The project was conceived as a way to mark the Onstad Center's 25th anniversary and Connecticut Explorer's 10th anniversary, but don't do the math on there, because of course it was a couple of years late. When the Wesleyans told me how long it would take a book, I'm like, I could do it faster, but they were right, and I was wrong. So that was just the first of the kernel of the idea of this book, first of the naivete that I have brought to many things that I have created, including the magazine. Sure, we can do a magazine of Connecticut history. But from its first issue, Connecticut Explored included stories about African American history. In fact, Frank Mitchell's wonderful story, I went back and reread it, a story about his mother, Betty Powers, a Hartford native, and her meeting Governor Raymond Baldwin when she was a college student at Bennett College for Women in 1946, appeared not only in our prototype, but in our very first issue in 2002. So by 2011, we had published 23 essays in the magazine, and I thought they'd work great as a collection in book form. And I made my pitch to Wesleyan University Press, who suggested I didn't quite have enough material to fill the book. So that's when I decided that I needed some partners. And so the editorial team, as I've named, got together and we brainstormed and we networked, and the book became this collection of 54 essays by about 30 scholars, and that together really tell the story of what we came to call the long arc of the African American experience in this state from the colonial period to the mid-20th century. So though it was never intended to be the definitive and complete history, of course, we felt it made a significant contribution in putting many pieces of the puzzle together and enabling the public history audience to begin to grasp the African American experience in Connecticut in its totality, really in the biggest, broadest, in that long arc. But we also really wanted it to be nuanced and complex, which of course it was bound to be. We also felt it contributed to providing a more accurate understanding of our state's history, how we've gotten to where we are today, and the legacy of the challenges we face as a state and a society. We wanted to bust some myths and challenge some broadly held ideas we have about Connecticut, some of which are surprisingly persistent, particularly around slavery in Connecticut. It was important for readers to gain this understanding through the lens of the African American experience. And so, for example, readers find the story of the Onstad affair, but not the one with its usual emphasis on white abolitionists and celebrity lawyers, but rather the response of the African American community to the Onstad captives' fight for freedom. And similarly, you won't find the story of state heroine Prudence Crandall, but you will learn about Crandall's student Sarah Harris and her quest for an education and professional vocation in the 1830s. You'll read about, of course, nationally prominent Black leaders like Reverend James Pennington and Jackie Robinson, and how Marian Anderson and Paul Robeson made their home in Connecticut. But you will also read about individuals who represent the everyman: local businessman William Lanson, Civil War soldier Joseph O. Cross, straight from the battlefield, World War II nurse Susan Freeman, pharmacist Anna Louise James, and outsider artist Ellis Ruley. Their stories convey their very specific and personal experiences, while illustrating the broader political and cultural challenges and opportunities of the times in which they lived. There are so many remarkable, inspiring stories in the book, and undoubtedly this audience knows many of them well. And I'm excited to hear more from our scholars tonight. So I just want to make a couple of last mentions. Since we published African American Connecticut Explored, we've published 2 books for children. Where I Live, Connecticut is a book and website for use with third grade curriculum in the state, and it's been widely adopted in Connecticut schools. And then a little more recently, Venture Smith's Colonial Connecticut, also a book and a website, uses Venture Smith's narrative as an entry point for grades 5 and up to learn about our state's founding and our country's founding. Venturesmith had so much to say about Connecticut's economy and how it worked. I think this is a wonderful resource. We've partnered on this with the Witness Stones Project, who's adopted it for use with their project as a resource for students as part of their program. And they've been a great partner with us as well. Both Venturesmith and where I live have lesson plans and curriculum support materials for educators, and we've got flyers out at the table in just outside the lobby there with information about how to access them, so please pick those up at the reception. African American Connecticut Explored itself is listed as a resource for the new high school elective, and we participated in that curriculum development project. But to facilitate access, there's also an extensive collection of African American history on Connecticut Explored's website under the Teach tab, including stories published since the book came out and lesson plans for use with the new high school elective. So again, visit our Teach page on ctexplored.org for more information. And of course, if you aren't yet a proud owner of African American Connecticut Explored, Wesleyan University Press has books for sale tonight. And I would also be remiss if I didn't invite you to subscribe to Connecticut Explored to continue your exploration of Connecticut history. You know, once a publisher, always a publisher. I'd like to next introduce our next speaker, Stacy Close, Dr. Stacy Close, Professor of African American History at Eastern Connecticut State University and co-editor of African American Connecticut Explored.
Good evening. It is quite a joy to be back here in New Haven. It's been a few years since I've been back, but I am delighted to be here tonight. I was asked to bring reflections, and so I had to do a lot of soul searching to figure out where I was going to begin with my reflections, because this project, this book, has meant so much to me deeply that when I was trying to figure out how long to talk, I realized that it couldn't be my normal 3-hour class time in terms of talking. But one of the things that I will do is I will begin here, because I remember at one time in the history of African people that some leading scholars said of African people and African history that there was no contribution to the world, nothing in terms of its development. But I soon came to realize that there was a huge failure in that notion. Because when we began to work on African American Connecticut Explored, I soon came to realize that, like our history in general, when it came to Connecticut, we were standing on the shoulders of giants. From the writings of people like Reverend James Pennington, to those of Deacon James Mars and James L. Smith, of the great W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. Carter Woodson, Ida B. Wells, William Lanson, as Elizabeth Norman mentioned, and Dr. John Blassingame, a longtime professor at Yale and one of my heroes, to Mary Townsend Seymour. They laid the foundation for us to follow. And I have to say in reflections that I have to thank Elizabeth Norman at Connecticut Explored. One of the things I thank her for very much is her vision. And one of the joys of working with her, Dr. Frank Mitchell, Olivia White, and also the late Dr. Catherine Harris, is they each left me with a certain message that I never forgot. Being around Olivia White at the Amistad, at the Wardrobe Athenaeum, brought me an extreme amount of joy, because as we were doing our editorial work and talking about what we were doing, you could feel the energy that she brought into the room. For my colleague, Dr. Frank Mitchell, also of the Amistad, listening to him was like listening to one of the great jazz records that I like to listen to. He has this thoughtful and engaging way of reflecting on issues, and you could feel that as we began to discuss what we were going to do. As far as for my colleague, the late Dr. Catherine Harris, She was an amazing historian of African American history and African Americans in foreign policy. She had been a full-time historian at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. She worked at UConn, was an adjunct at Central, and she contributed to historical overviews of early African American history, and she also wrote an outstanding piece of research on the life of William Lansing of New Haven. Having been raised by a family with farming roots in Georgia and attending school there over 12 years, public schools, not a single word about an African American was ever issued in any of my history courses that I took in high school, not one. In this project that we worked on now, it has meant that we have had an impact not only on the lives of young people and students, but we've also had an impact on Public Act 1912. It's a coalition of leaders, many of you know, led by people like Dr. Benjamin Foster, who have pushed for that legislation to bring African Americans into the classroom. And we are thankful for their dedicated work. And we're also thankful for the work of our dedicated teachers all throughout Connecticut, who even before Public Act 1912 were teaching African American history. One of the things we have to remember as we reflect on the work that we do, and also think about what is to come, the exploration, study, reading, and the writing of African American history in Connecticut is an ongoing march which we can never retreat from. And in terms of tonight, I'm very excited tonight because as one of the, and I tell my students this, as one of the elder historians who teaches African American history in the state of Connecticut, I am delighted tonight to hear from a group of young historians who are going to talk about not only our history, but also, as Elizabeth said, begin to think about moving this discussion even further. So, part of what I'm supposed to do is provide introductions, and I won't be too long because I'm really excited about hearing from everybody. Tonight we have Dr. Frank Mitchell of the Amistad Center for Art and Culture. We have Dr. Brittany Yancey from Illinois College, Dr. Harold Williams of the University of St. Thomas, and Dr. Fiona Renal from the University of Connecticut, and Dr. Carmucha Scruggs from Central Connecticut State University. It is indeed a wonderful night of celebration. 10 years of hard work. When I began this project, my sons were 2 years old. And now I'm very proud that I can tell them that I've been at work on this for 10 years. One of the more joyous moments for me was when they started in preschool and the bus pulled up, and before they got off the bus driver got off, and the bus driver had a copy of African American Connecticut Explorer. And she opened the back cover and she asked, "Is that you?" And I said, "It is," with joy. It is a very, very moving time for us. And without further ado, I will turn the floor over to our young colleagues. Thank you, everyone.
First of all, thank you for having me, and I want to just extend a heartfelt congratulations to everyone involved in the African American Connecticut Explorer. I am Dr. Brittany Yancey. I am an assistant professor of history and African American studies at Illinois College in Jacksonville, Illinois. I'm a proud graduate of the University of Connecticut, where I received my doctorate in U.S. history. And I look at Black women's intellectual and political history with a focus on Black radicalism, with a focus specifically on the Black Power era. So currently I am working on a couple of projects, but all of them, in addition to my teaching, I also head up the African American Studies program here on campus. And so it gives me great pleasure to be here.
What did the publication mean to you?
So this was a really invaluable source. When it was published and came out, I was in the middle of my doctoral work. And My dissertation focused on women in the Black Panther Party in the New Haven chapter. And for me, this was just such an area that I was very passionate about. And very specifically, I was interested in capturing the voices of these women. And so one of the inspirations for this work was the work of Dr. Williams. So it's a pleasure that we get to share space tonight virtually. Definitely just read all of his work, and the chapter specifically that is in the African American Connecticut Explorer book really was inspiration for me. Someone who was interested in pursuing oral history, in telling this work, really being able to elevate voices that are often silenced in the narrative, looking at the experiences of women, taking up questions of the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, class, all of it coming together as I'm exploring what is happening in New Haven. And what really became of that was this kind of wonderful narrative, right, of community, wonderful narrative of what Black power looked like, how women in particular are defining and redefining, right, meanings of citizenship, meaning of justice, meaning of humanity. And I had the privilege being very committed, right, to following the approaches of Dr. Williams and other scholars that are pursuing this work, particularly looking at the Panther Party, of elevating these voices. And I was able to connect with incredible women like Erica Huggins, right? I mean, the founder of the New Haven chapter, community members and other members that were of the chapter, like Elise Brown, Rosemary Mealy. These are incredible women who stories really needed to be elevated. And so when I really think about the inspiration behind my doctoral work, I'm just proud to be in this space to say a book, right, like the African American Connecticut Explorer was part of those critical sources, critical texts that helped me shape my work. And so again, even just beyond the Black Panthers, just in general, allowed me to get a fuller picture, right, of the African American experience in Connecticut. It was invaluable.
Where do you think the field of African American history and African American studies is headed in Connecticut going forward?
A couple years ago, when we were coming up on the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment, I was asked to join the suffrage commission organized by the Secretary of State. And what was very clear to me were the gaps in the way that our state remembers and tells the history of women of color in our state. Nothing that I was not unfamiliar with, but certainly there were ways, and as we were kind of working together, thinking about, what would this work look like in terms of honoring, commemorating, remembering the women who advanced, right, this movement. And I joined efforts with my colleagues at the Connecticut Museum, Dr. Karen Lee Miller and Eileen Frank, and we put together a project called The Work Must Be Done that looked at women of color in their pursuit of freedom and voting rights specifically. And the work that we have done and we continue to do, because the project is ever evolving, um, lends the question that we must ask more critical questions around race, around gender, agency, self-determination. We must look at the experiences of women of color in particular, and particularly African American women. And what we were able to unveil with this project is that at the turn of the 20th century, you have a robust organizing generation of Black women who are establishing clubs all across Connecticut in the late 19th century, from Norwich, Sonia, Stanford, New Haven, Hartford. You have a culture, you have a movement, and ways in which not only are they making impact and change on for the state, but on a national scale. They're involved in national organizations that they're bringing people like Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell to Connecticut. Why don't we know these stories? Why aren't these women documented, remembered in our spaces, in our schools, in our curriculum? And so I think what will be critical going forward is asking more intentional questions about those who are oftentimes on the margins of our narrative. And a lot of it dealing with issues of these kind of intersectional questions, right? That are bringing, right, those that are often overlooked to the center of analysis, and really being able to unveil and reveal these stories.
What would you say to young scholars embarking on the study of African American history in Connecticut? What message would you have for them?
One of the things that I would just offer to young scholars is to pursue African American studies by centering humanity and agency. And whether you're talking about women in the Black freedom movement, you're talking about African American men who served in the military, whatever topic that you're approaching with, the approach is particularly what is so critical, that you are approaching your work centering humanity and agency. I recently just designed a course called Rethinking American Enslavement. And I thought very deeply about, how do we teach enslavement, right? How do we teach it in a way that provides humanity and agency to those who are enslaved? And I think those are the types of questions that I think scholars need to ask, right? To be able to really tell a full narrative that gets at more complexity in the way in which we study African descended people in this country and around the world.
Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm sorry that we couldn't have you here in person, but it's just wonderful to see you and hear your thoughts.
And I know that I have a lot of friends in the room and a lot of people who have supported me along my journey that are on this panel. Always have to give gratitude to Dr. Vernal, who is just a mentor and continues to be such a support. All of you, I spent a lot of time in the New Haven Museum. So I feel like this is almost like a homecoming a little bit virtually, because so many of you, Dr. Close has also been just such a great scholar that has impacted my work. So just want to say thank you and allowing me to be part of the conversation. And again, congratulations, and I look forward to the next 10 years.
Dr. Williams, welcome this evening. And could you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, thank you. First, I want to say congratulations. I'm so excited to be here this evening. And my name is Uhuru Williams. I'm a professor of history, distinguished university chair, and founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota.
We're so glad to have you here this evening. What got you involved with African American Connecticut Explored?
The Connecticut Explored was a tremendous resource for me when I was in graduate school and kind of in the process of thinking about Connecticut history, and then in particular, looking at the history of the Black Panther Party in New Haven, Connecticut. There were all these incredible scholars who were influential on me at that time. The person I think of most is Stacy Close. It's incredible, academic, great person who have been doing work on the African American experience in Connecticut, and actually influenced me in the sense that as I was looking for a dissertation topic, I was thinking, I grew up in Connecticut, and for so many years had heard about the infamous Black Panther trial there and wanted to kind of dig into that story more deeply. But then, even after my book was published, remained, somewhat surprised that there wasn't this body of literature on the African American experience in Connecticut that you find in other places, and felt that we needed a volume like African American Connecticut Explored to really help not only plumb that as a resource, but more importantly, to introduce these rich stories that remain largely uncovered in Connecticut history. So there's this tremendous, I think, wealth of material yet to be explored by scholars to complement the work of people like Catherine Harris and Stacy Close and many others who really are pioneers in this area and who've given us this, rich tapestry, which we're still adding to, of the African American experience in Connecticut.
Going forward, what kind of research would you like to see in African American history and society in Connecticut?
There's so much, and I think one of the things that's so great about this volume is I think any graduate student, any undergraduate student, any high school student who's looking at this would be inspired to find so much about the African American experience, the Black experience in America, which has roots in Connecticut, which, many of these essays, as fantastic as they are really just starters. There's so much to be unpacked in what many of these scholars kind of uncover and share. The great short essay on Jackie McLean, for example, by his relative and his influence on Connecticut history. I grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I remember Jackie McLean coming to the Cultural Arts Center there in the 1970s when I was a kid and holding these incredible music seminars. That part of the Black experience with regard to the arts is very important. Bridgeport's often called the Park City. I often say that Bridgeport should be called the Art City. And Jackie McLean's story, like the story of the Cultural Arts Center, is a small part of that story. Connecticut Explored, for me, is this treasure trove of, suggestions that young scholars and young people could explore. You're going to get, this great entree to the African American experience in Connecticut, but it also I think opens up, and I'll say so for myself, there are many books that I'd love to have the time to write just from reading through the incredible essays that are in this volume.
So you also are involved in a lot of social justice work with your institute at the University of St. Thomas. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I actually came out to Minnesota to be the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of St. Thomas, and post the murder of George Floyd, transitioned my role into running the Racial Justice Initiative. And the cornerstone of my work is in historical recovery, the argument that if we're trying to make substantive change with regard to racial justice, we have to begin with the historical roots of how we got here. It's very consistent with what John Lewis wrote in his final letter to the American people, which was published posthumously in 2020, shortly after he passed, in the New York Times, in which he talked about the importance of history and the fact that the reason that we struggle so much with so many of these issues relative to racial justice is because we have this historical amnesia about how we got here. And so my work of historical recovery is really saying, let's look at the roots of policing and the criminal legal system in Minnesota to get our heads in around how we might actually not reform, but reimagine the criminal legal system in Minnesota. And again, I think that my experience in Connecticut and my work with not only this project, but my other work in Connecticut actually set me up for this, because this idea of historical recovery, the fact that we need to revisit our history, not because history repeats itself, but because it echoes, is important. And it's in kind of identifying those echoes and thinking concretely, broadly, more imaginatively how we can tackle some of the issues that continue to resonate in our contemporary moment, that we actually might develop a blueprint for real and meaningful change. So, I know that we are celebrating at the New Haven Museum and at Fairfield University, and I just would like to say, remind particularly the young scholars in the audience or anyone who's interested in this history, there's so much yet to be documented and uncovered about the African American experience in Connecticut, so much important history yet to be told. And I would hope that as we celebrate this 10-year anniversary, we're also thinking concretely about the ways in which that history can be informative in contemporary struggles for racial justice and equality, but also simply sets the groundwork for how we can be much more intentional in understanding our experience as Americans. I share that because we are having this conversation in the midst of unprecedented efforts across the country to limit access to and restrict access of students to African American history, to Black history. It is, in this pioneering work, Connecticut scholars were tackling that a decade ago, publishing it in this fine book. But if we're not continuing to share this work, continuing to think about the work that remains to be done, let's be clear, as phenomenal this is, we need a volume 2, we need a volume 3. I'd like to see this work continued. I'd like to continue to contribute. And I'd also, again, like to honor my friends in particular, or the people who influenced me, Catherine Harris and Stacy Close in particular. Thank you for your work, but it's also a call to action. We have to continue the work.
First of all, thanks for coming, you guys. It's amazing. Full house. I think we had a full house in 2014 when we did this, and it's great to have a big crowd here tonight. I also want to shout out my thanks to Elizabeth Norman. I remember when she was running around the state promoting this book everywhere. At that point, I did know high school students in schools in lots of places. And I would see somebody from the foot and they would say, "Do you know someone named Elizabeth Norman?" I said, "Yeah." She did a full school assembly today about that book. I was just like, I wouldn't do that. So God bless you. You're doing God's work, so thanks. And it's great that it's still being read and really important. Also need to note, as Elizabeth mentioned, as part of the full night of fun, we are celebrating Constance Baker Motley at the Q House right at this moment. And that party could go on and on and on, so you may have time to race over there, dance a little bit, and buy some stamps. If you don't buy the stamps tonight, you should definitely get some of those stamps tomorrow. Anything else on my notes here? Yeah, so as it says in the program, I'm Frank Mitchell. I am curator at large at the Amistad Center for Art and Culture, where we have an exhibition actually within the Wadsworth, and it takes its title from a little moment in Lorraine Hansberry's Raising in the Sun, where I think the mother tells somebody, "There's always something more to love." And then it goes, "And if you don't know that, you ain't learned nothing." And I feel like that there's always something a little more to love is a great way of thinking about this project and this work. 1976-77 was a great year for this kind of scholarship. The Afro-American Struggle Society here in New Haven got its start as part of the bicentennial. There were lots of great books, including Roots. I think there's some great cookbooks that came out of that year, so lots of big stuff. And it was the first time folks started thinking about, well, around here, got the resources to imagine a schooner parading around and calling itself the Amistad Schooner. So that was a great prompt. In the 90s, we got the Freedom Trail and a lot more work being done in places. Like just before that, this institution and CHS hosted sort of dueling exhibitions about the Amistad story. And then in the 2000s, we got more. So we've been building this great momentum around these stories. And it's been amazing. It's sort of hard to believe it's been that long. But there's still more to love. Still a lot more to do. Still a lot more out there. Looking around this room, I think half the people in this room are doing things already. So thank you. Doesn't have to be scholars, lots of room for everybody to do something. The rest of you guys, come join us, plenty more. It's a really old state. We've got plenty of history. People open boxes every day and find new things. So if you want to know these things, if you want to tell these stories and celebrate these figures in this history, there's room for you. Still more to love. So tonight we're going to spend a little time loving each other and celebrating this. I think that's the other thing I wanted to note, that we do this work, it's somewhat hard, it definitely feels like labor, and we don't stop to celebrate, so we're definitely celebrating. So that there's cake and pie, and we should do this more often, do hard work, but also stop and recognize people and have a good time somehow around it, because it only makes it better. So this is our party to do that. So with that beginning, I want to turn to my dear friends here and talk a bit about the work that we're doing here in Connecticut now. And as Stacy alluded to, this is a chance to look towards the future as well as celebrating the past. So we have a couple questions that we're going to pass back and forth between us, and then we will be happy to have you ask us questions as well, or talk to each other, or some combination of that. Sound good? Great. So how do you guys want to start? Do a quick introduction, just say your name, offer questions, what feels good? Okay. Well, I'm going to pass it to you. And maybe the question I will prompt you with is, if you want to say a bit about yourself, your affiliation, your name, and then tell us how you connect to engage scholarship, public humanities, public history, where you see yourself in that genre of work.
Thanks everyone for being here. I'm Fiona Bernal. I am Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut, History and Africana Studies. I always have to remember that I'm in 2 units. I sometimes feel like an interloper here. I am an Africanist first. I'm trained as an Africanist. I'm a South African historian. I thought I was going to spend every waking moment of my life working on South African history. Thought I was going to move to South Africa, and I thought about somebody in Connecticut, so that didn't happen. And I was slowly drawn in to local Connecticut history through all your fault, right? Dr. Close invited me to his class. I started working on a West Indian history project with the former Connecticut Historical Society, now the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, and that was really where I started getting involved in public history. I saw myself reflected in the project that the Connecticut Historical Society was doing. They were looking for a community liaison. I was at Yale. I didn't know anything about Hartford because I grew up in Jersey. And when they hired me as a liaison, I started conducting oral histories, and I felt like I was with my aunts and uncles and grandparents. Everybody was so proud of me as a graduate student and started bragging about me. People were calling me their adopted daughter, their adopted niece, and I realized that I had come home and started wishing my mom had migrated to Hartford and not New Jersey. Not happening in New Jersey. And so that was actually my first introduction to doing public history. I'm trained as a public historian, as an oral historian for South African history, but it was my work with the Connecticut Historical Society, Connecticut Museum, that really brought me squarely into that space and introduced me to the rest of you guys.
Your show at Trinity.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am Kenesha Scruggs, Assistant Professor of History at Central Connecticut State University. I am a Texan transplant, a native Texan, and began my doctoral work at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, in which I received a PhD in African American history, and also in public history as well. And for me, public history has always been telling the story of people that look like me. Whether for me it was telling the story of my elder community women, and their lived experiences. For me, it's always bringing history to a broader audience, making it more palatable, whether that's walking the woods and discussing Du Bois, or simply working on a project in which people see themselves and are able to ask the questions, how do I fit into this? How do I fit into these local histories, and how do I fit into these larger histories? So that's really somewhat of my entry into public history. I also have worked briefly as an intern for the National Park Service. As an intern at the Abraham Lincoln Home, and to be able to talk to people who come to this house, right, of this man that defines our country, and to have them know the local connections. How are these people normal? Right? Like, at the end of the day, I know that our historical individuals are name brand characters, but at the end of the day, they really are just normal people, and they have normal lives. And for me, that makes people connect to these historical individuals that we have. So all of that, and all of a sudden I moved the state over, and now I'm doing it here in Connecticut, and I'm looking forward to these future partnerships and endeavors, and once again, teaching people how to tell their local stories and to bring it to broader audiences.
Thank you, guys. So you see how easy it is to be drawn into this. It's not easy to do it well. It takes a lot of work to do it well. It's hard. It takes a lot of practice, but it's easy to be drawn in. So think about, for the next big anniversary, the 250th, it's coming right up. Are there stories out there that you want to help us tell?
What year is the 250?
26? So the next question is about projects, things that you are doing in Connecticut or nearby that you think we should know more about. So if you have a current project, a favorite project, a project that seems to exemplify where you're headed as an engaged scholar that's happening here in Connecticut or in a neighboring state.
So, projects that are coming up. So, at the moment, I just ripped up the floor at the West Indian Social Club and turning it into part of it into a museum. And we're going to try to open for fall with a soft launch in the spring. That is, and I mentioned that because it's actually a direct outcome of having conducted the oral histories at the Connecticut Historical Society, and at that time, in the late 1990s, you know, when you conduct oral histories, you're not necessarily curating those stories in the community space, right? And this was an opportunity for the Connecticut Museum to revisit that relationship with the West Indian Social Club and to actually lend their staff to us to say, let's curate and re-envision what these stories can look like at the West Indian Social Club. So that is like the project that keeps me up at night, because I'm working with electricians and carpenters and flooring contractors, and I've never done anything like that before. I usually am only like sort of watching Frank and how he curates exhibits, and trying to do it in my like much cheaper $5,000 budget later. So that is something I'm really proud of, and that is all hands on deck with everybody at the West Indian Social Club, UConn Foundation, Connecticut Humanities, and everybody at the staff at the Connecticut Museum to get this new Caribbean Heritage Museum up and going to tell Connecticut stories. And then the second project is something called Hartford Bound, and I was very much inspired by this volume, because as I was being forcibly drawn into being a U.S. historian, U.S. historian, African American historian, West Indian historian, Caribbean historian, and Puerto Rican historian, I thought if I was going to be drawn into it, actually Connecticut Explored is the perfect entryway for me, right? And so I actually did have that volume by my bedside as I was slowly trying to figure out, okay, I need to master these stories, I need to figure out these narratives, I need to engage with the scholars who have created these narratives, and I need to figure out where I fit. Like, one of the things that strikes me is sometimes, you know, it might look like there's like a critical mass of us, right? There's never seen so many Black historians in one group, right? But we need like 30, 50 historians doing this work. And I've even had folks say to me, "Oh, you're working on tobacco? Dr. Close does that, you know, you don't want to do that. He's probably already said everything there is to be said. Oh, you want to work on the Great Migration, but Dr. Close is also doing that." And I said, "Don't worry, Dr. Close knows that I'm doing this. In fact, he invited me to his class." Things that inspired me about the volume is especially that biographical approach. Like, there's a significant proportion of the essays, right, that have used that biographical lens. And I decided that in figuring out what my space is to tell stories, that I would adopt some of those biographical approaches. And I can say a little bit about some of the other characters that I'm working on, but I'm currently obsessed with a Black woman who, to be brutally honest, the reason why I was so fascinated with her is because the day I discovered her, she had so much money in her checking account. So much more than me. Like, in 1840, she had a ridiculous amount of money, and I had no idea where she was getting it from. And I thought, how does this woman have more money than I do? And that was what I said, I'm going to figure out how this woman got this money. But in jest, but in all seriousness, she donated her money to help pay the salary of James Pennington, from the Top Street Congregational Church. And I thought, well, that really took vision. I wonder what made her earmark all of her money. She had property. She wanted the property to be sold to benefit the Catholic Church. She had a ridiculous amount of money in her savings account. She wanted that money to be donated to the church to specifically pay for his salary as long as they remain congregational. And she says, and it doesn't really matter what they change their name to, as long as they are still congregational. And so I was really fascinated about this Black woman in the 1840s who has the vision to leave her entire estate and her property to this church to pay for this minister's salary. And so in the process of digging into her history, I found her father, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, and his name was London. And I realized that much later on, I think as a way of saying, I am now a free man, took on the name of free black, and then passed on that name to his daughter, his only daughter. And so she's my current obsession. I have found that she has property in Windsor and Granby. She's suing people all the time. That's how she got some of her money. She's leasing land and she's following up with them because they're not paying their rent. She's also working in the house of the Chief Justice of the Connecticut Supreme Court, former Mayor of Hartford. And she is in the household of these, sort of early abolitionists. And I'm very much convinced, that these men that she's networking with are very much in the background in helping to execute her vision. Not shape her vision, but to execute her vision. Because I checked all of their wills and they didn't give anybody to the church. But they are the executors on her estate. They're the witnesses to her will, and they play a really important role in bringing her vision to fruition. So those are some of the stories I'm digging into, and so for now she's Catherine Freebody, early Black philanthropist.
Right. I'm still new, right? I'm still new to Connecticut, as I'm still charting my way across Connecticut. This book really kind of introduces me to Connecticut history, particularly Connecticut African American history, because often, as a native Texan, I was like, Connecticut is somewhere up there, top right corner, right? Is there African American history in Connecticut? Apparently there is. And so, first of all, I want to thank the individual, Dr. Close, the co-laborers, as I call you all in the academic field. Thank you for your work. It gives, as we've been told, these young scholars like myself, room to work with. I do early 20th century history, and so for me, I want to know what is the experience of African Americans in Connecticut post-emancipation, right? Because Connecticut, of course, emancipation happened much earlier than on a national scale. What does it look like for individuals here? I also want to look at working class people. For me, I've always wanted to tell the stories of people that look like me, people that have done just working class labor. What does that look like in the early 20th century? I'm sure I will have to have several conversations with Dr. Close about that, and I look forward to those. Also for public history, right? Public history, initially, I really thought it was the study of houses of old white people, right? And as I have worked in various places, I realized it's really the story of people. How do we tell the stories of individuals? Because at the end of the day, for me, history just happens to be ordinary people doing not so ordinary things. It just happens to have a date attached to it, right? And so I think that, for me, is where I want to start my projects, where I want to build more community partnerships, and also, once again, back to the local stories. Because hometown people really are the gatekeepers. They really are the guardians of these stories. And they're the ones who are going to make sure that these stories continue and have an afterlife, even whether it's telling their children, their grandchildren, or their exhibits, or there's some type of public display, right? These are the individuals that are going to advocate for that. So for me, I just want to equip the public with these tools so they can tell the story. So as far as the current project, I really don't have one at the moment. I'm still, like I said, feeling my way through, and of course working on initial projects, book projects, things that academics have to do, but also as far as the public, getting out and talking to, whether it's individuals who have businesses and communities for generations and decades. I want to tell their stories, because that to me tells the story of African American economic independence, African American economic performance, right? These faith communities, these organizations, and how rich they are and how they really contribute to our understanding of who we are.
Conference there. It's 7:10, so we wanted to throw it out to you, conversation. The question we were going to ask next really was about what do folks want to see in the future? What's missing? What should the next big project be? And it doesn't have to just be a research project. It could be an exhibition. It could be a monument. It could be a memorial. It could be some combination of those things. But what don't we see in our public humanities landscape that tell us these stories? And I'll just get us started. I've been watching, I binged the 2 episodes last night of Ryan Murphy's Feud. This year is June Capote versus the Swans. So I'm looking for Feud, Black History version. Du Bois versus Garvey, or Langston Hughes versus Zora Hurston, or Adam Clayton Powell versus everybody, because he's always the villain in everything. And that's a question for folks out in the audience. One of you guys can answer that too. Yeah, we want to party, but I don't know if there's a mic out there, so maybe I can just stand up and shout it. Please.
Hello everyone. Thank you all for sharing your insights and all of your contributions. My name is Tiffany Walton, and I recently learned about Ann Petrie, a Old Saybrook native that I did not know about in all my years of attending elementary, middle, high school, and college in Connecticut. And interestingly enough, I learned about her because I was in Chicago, and I was actually just sitting to a local from Chicago because I saw her book in a bookstore, and I read the back cover, learned that she was from Saybrook and that her family was established there for quite some time, and she wrote a book that was a national bestseller in the 1940s, and I was just blown away. And it was somewhat intentional that she kept a low profile because she did find the media to be very invasive, but her contributions were, of course, really important. And I say that to say there has been some efforts to publicize her work, and I think that would be great because, of course, she's now deceased, and her daughter did share some more about her life after she passed, but I think that would be a great opportunity to highlight a trailblazer from the 1940s that made a really huge contribution with the street and some other work that she also did. So thank you all so much for your contributions, and I just love learning about everything that you all have to say, and I look forward to learning more.
No, I mean, I think we should organize a readathon. Not only organize a readathon, but also of course, it's February, it's Black History Month, and the theme is African American and the arts, right? So art and literature, right? So how can we think about that on a local level? Like, how can we celebrate someone who's local who definitely has a national impact, right? So perhaps, as an enlightened member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, perhaps you can think about maybe presenting a paper or a panel or a poster, even at our meeting that we're having in Pittsburgh later this year.
And there's a lot to say about Ann Petrie and the James family and their relationships, and we should do a sidebar kind of thing. But yeah, it's a big story, but the book is a nice way to delve into more. We should just popcorn up and start asking questions. We have a mic.
So, hi, my name is Dr. Brian Bailey, and I am a native New Haven. I have 40 years in the educational system in Connecticut, and I'm a retired educator, not retired. I work on another. First of all, let me say thank you for this, and whoever is here that wrote this, I do want my book autographed. So that's the first thing. The second thing I want, and Dr. Close referenced Public Act 1912. And for those of you who may not know Public Act 1912, that is the legislation that in 2022 stated that every grade 9 through 12th grade student, high school student, must have the opportunity to take an African American history course. And so that was great, we celebrated that, but there's a disconnect. We need a pre-K through 8 bridge. So if you want to talk about what I want a pre-K through 8 bridge, and I don't want it to be optional. With this much history, this needs to be a mandatory course. So I'm sure that you all are not the legislators, but you are the legislator makers. So what this retired educator wants is this information in elementary schools. We need to get this information and not wait till they're in high school or going off to college, but in every child needs this information. That's what Dr. Bailey wants.
I'm happy to say that your vision is shared by the sponsors of that bill, and it is going to, I'm optimistic that it's going to happen.
Yeah, and there's 2 hands over here, Debbie, and then the first one behind you.
Well, I was inspired by your feud approach. I follow the news all the time about education and about racial issues that are bedeviling us, and the particular part of me for speaking poorly about Texas. That I mean no disrespect, because we're not a perfect state by any means. But there is a Connecticut approach to education that goes back to Horace Mann and has been around for a long time. That is a very different one than the DeSantis approach. And I would like to see, we read all the time about how are they doing, what's going on down there, and maybe it's not all down there, but what's going on in states where they're trying to clamp down on this kind of education. I would love to see Connecticut kind of stand up in a big public way as we are going to be a beacon for some other approach, rather than just having to be like, we're the de facto. Let's get a debate going somehow. And also, oh, sorry, last question. I'd like to know if you ever learned what squash pie. I was just looking at your book, and your essay is about squash pie.
I make a much better squash pie than I did when I wrote the essay. Thank you.
I like, well, you asked the question, what's missing? And I'd like to raise the connection between the indigenous people of Connecticut with the African American people who came and mingled. I have this interest because my across the street neighbor of 40 years was an African American lady, very proud, bought her own house. First registered nurse at Yale New Haven Hospital, and worked there for almost 50 years. Remarkable lady. And we became great friends, and she casually mentioned to me, I said, where did you grow up? And she said, oh, Woodbury, Connecticut. And casually mentioned my grandmother was full-blooded Native American, an Indian. And it was really, she had fairly dark skin, and it didn't occur to me that she would be related to. Well, I subsequently, along with her, we went and explored, took a trip up to Woodbury, and I began to realize that she's actually, I finally said to her, your people have been here for 5,000 years, never mind 400 years. And, there's this very profound connection there. And it seems like we're seeing more of the American Indian culture rising at this time. But I'm not seeing that so much in connection with Connecticut. We all know about the casinos, up in the other part of the state, but who knew that, in Woodbury, Connecticut, near Waterbury, there was, and in fact, the entire state, when you start looking at the names of all the places in our state, 80% of them are Native American words. So I would just like to see that connection, and specifically with Connecticut, and that deeper, 5,000 years. I mean, people can walk from that 10,000 years, but if we just wanted to stay in the woodland period, as it's called, but that's a very profound connection that needs to get into the mix of the conversation.
Thank you for that segue. There is an exhibition that will be opening in April at Mystic Seaport. It's called Entwined, and it is following indigenous and African contributions to the making of the Northeast Maritime Corridor. So, hold your breath. Be here in no time.
Hi. Hi, everyone. So you probably saw me downstairs. My name is Ivana. I obviously work at New Haven Museum. But my question is kind of a selfish ask, because I worked with Fiona and Tom Thurston here last year on basically a working seminar on how to teach about eugenics in Connecticut. And what I'm trying to find right now, I'm in the middle of my graduate thesis at the moment, so again, selfish ask. But what I'm really struggling looking for is Black healing space in Connecticut, and alternative ways of healing that expands beyond the medical, Western medical space. So I'm struggling to find it. Obviously, I'm looking in more non-traditional spaces like churches and community-based organizations. But yeah, that's what I'm really looking for. I stumped the room. Think about African American medical schools, for example, right?
what are they bringing with them? What experiences, what are they bringing from their communities, even though they're getting, the academic training, but also what are they bringing with them, right? So perhaps you may need to look into archives of African American medical schools, perhaps, as an example. Tell me about that. Hopefully there is.
And even Yale Medical School. So, one of the treasures that was uncovered as we were putting together the exhibition, Timeless, comes in Big Vermont. And this stuff was all in Connie Royster's garage. Having survived 50, 60 years in basements and garages and attics, it's a wonder any of it exists. But there were two kind of newsletters that emerged from Dixwell, local businesses. Dan Stewart would go on to sort of be a stringer for Black press, kind of following New England news and getting it into all kinds of larger newspapers around the country. In the 1930s, he and a friend created these sort of circulars that listed local businesses and anybody who had something to sell or wanted to buy something. I don't know if you can call these things, but they only exist in Connie's garage. So we made some copies, and there may be something in there that would speak to some of the medicine, the non-traditional medicine and kind of folk ways that people were interested in. And also some of the documents at the State Library that record the societies that came into Connecticut cities in the 1920s and 30s. They do talk about some of the fair societies and things like that. Some of those documents may have references to funerary traditions and other kinds of things that happen because of the societies that could be helpful. So yeah, I can talk about that.
Yes, for sure.
Other questions? It's getting close to 7:30, so you guys want my cake. And that would be fine too. We can help you hostage for a while. We can definitely hang out and chat for as long as you want, informally. If that's what it feels like. You have been amazing. It's great to see you. Buy the book, buy the stamps, go to the Q House.